Hello everyone, how are you doing? I read 6 books in the month of September, these 5 right here, plus one more on my Kindle, and we're gonna take a few minutes to talk about them. Lately, I've been drinking this caffeine-free Diet Coke, and every time I do, I feel like a little New York socialite, very like, I don't know, upper class, like so fancy with my caffeine-free Diet Coke. I'm all here for this vibe. Anyways, I first want to give a little introduction about my sort of reading journey, since we haven't really talked about that. I have been in a reading slump, a major reading slump, for the last 2 years, and this is the first month where I felt like I've got out of it. I've been reading a lot. I read 6 books. The first book I read was starting September 7th, so that's been in like 3 weeks. That's a crazy volume for me, which means that these were pretty good. As a quick little history, in 2018 I picked up reading after many years of not reading at all. I used to very much not enjoy reading. I don't really picture images too much in my head, so reading for me is not like watching a movie. I can't visualize it very well. But in 2018, I discovered reading, and very quickly I fell in love with it. In 2019 and 2020, I read so much. And then I got to college, and where did that hobby go? Who knows? I don't know. Life got hard in college, and reading was like the first thing to go. But now I am out of college, and I have been watching so much BookTube and reading so much, clearly. And I was like, why don't I make my own little reading wrap up? Because I have a YouTube channel, and I've been a part of this community for a while. I feel like it's a return to form. You know, I'm back, so I want to contribute a little bit. We're all caught up. Let's start with the first book I read in September. Bear with me here. It's called The Butchering Art. It was a 5-star. This story starts on Labor Day weekend. I visited Philadelphia with some friends and family, and we went to the Mutter Museum, which, if you are not familiar with that, is basically this museum about death and illness, and they have like mummified bodies and like tumors in jars and crazy shit like that. If you saw my very first video about books, that was about how a lot of my favorite books are about death. And so the museum was like right up my alley. Note, if you're gonna go there, do not eat before you go there. It's gonna take you about an hour to get through it, and I had a Philly cheesesteak before, and I would recommend not doing that. But after the museum, I went to the little gift shop, and I spotted this book, and I sort of wanted like a little takeaway, something to bring home. This had great scores on Goodreads, and I was like, all right, let's do it. This book is a biography about Joseph Lister, who was a Victorian doctor, and he revolutionized surgery. Before Lister, there was lots of death in surgery, and they could only sort of operate on like extremities, because if they operated on like the chest or something like that, very often it would get infected and you would die. Joseph basically went on a quest to solve this problem. He was the one who really introduced cleanliness to the operating room, and it was because of his methodologies that surgery is what it is today, and we can do a lot more in surgery and have a lot fewer deaths. One of the like tricky things about reading a book like this is it can very easily be way academic. I don't want to feel like I'm reading a textbook. I want to feel like I'm reading a story, and Fitzharris does a great job at illustrating a story with this. It was something where it didn't feel bogged down by like terms I didn't know and technical details. It felt like you were reading throughout his life and the parts of his upbringing that made him be who he was. One sort of funny quote towards the start of the book that I want to read for you here. Before Lister's time, surgeons had to act very fast on their surgeries because often there wasn't any anesthetic and the patient would just be sitting there feeling that pain. Well, one surgeon, his name was Liston, he was a bit before Joseph Lister's time, he, acting fast, once accidentally killed 3 people in one surgery. He killed the patient from infection, his assistant because he whacked the assistant's fingers while operating on the patient, and his assistant also got infected. And he also killed a bystander as well, who was killed from the fright. Quote, "It was the only surgery in history said to have a 300% fatality rate." This is awesome. Like this is so much fun to read. I had a great time with it, and I gave this book 5 stars. The next book I picked up in September was Vicious by V.E. Schwab. This is book 1 of the Villains Duology. Starting with Vicious here, I thought the concept of this book was pretty cool. It basically takes place in a world where there are these people called extraordinaries, and these extraordinaries have a certain power. When I started reading, I was under the impression that they were superheroes and supervillains, but it's more like they have one power. I don't want to spoil their power, but we follow 2 of these extraordinaries and we follow sort of their rivalry. I liked how both of the main characters, Victor and Eli, were differing levels of murderous. Like, they were both horrible people, and I found myself at first rooting for the wrong person because we were from the perspective of the main character, and I was like, wow, this guy's really an asshole. Maybe the other person is the good guy. Turns out he was more of an asshole. So I thought Vicious was really cool. I gave it 4 stars because I thought there was a little bit in the middle that kind of dragged on. Like, they were building up and up and up to this climax, and it was like, all right, like, tension's already high. And then the end happened within like 20 pages and it was over. And I was like, okay, what am I supposed to do now? Like, I was hoping for a little bit more at the climax, a little bit bigger, and a little bit after the climax. But I thought the way it ended was really cool. It just came too quick. Moving on to Vengeful, this definitely widens the world. This takes it bigger than Vicious did. I felt like the strengths and weaknesses of this book really traded punches with the first one. The first one was a little limited in scope and the climax happened a little too quick. This one was really broad in scope, like really big, and the climax was like kind of a continuing climax all the time. But at the same time, this book also had some weaknesses that the first one did not. Both Vicious and Vengeful have time jumps, but in Vicious, it's just the present and then like 15 years ago, and then the present, and so on and so forth. In Vengeful, dude, there is like 4 years ago, and 3 years ago, and 6 months ago, and 18 months ago, and 4 weeks ago, and last night, and today. Like, it is so many time jumps. It gets confusing of like, okay, what does this character know at this point in the timeline? That was a bit confusing for the first like half of the book until the time jump started to lessen and it was just more taking place in the present. Also felt like a couple of the characters weren't really built up enough to justify some of the actions that they took. They would make a decision and it just sort of felt out of left field because they hadn't been built up enough to make that decision make sense in the context of the story. And then there was one other thing about this book that I didn't like very much. In the first book, it sort of takes place between these 2 characters, Victor and Eli. We follow Victor and from his perspective. The first book does a really great job of building up Victor the character and his morals. I felt like in this book that was kind of compromised for storytelling. Like, I just felt like some of the decisions Victor made were not decisions book 1 Victor would have made. I still really enjoyed it and had a lot of fun. I gave it 4 stars. It just, like I said, traded punches in terms of strengths and weaknesses with the first book. All right, book 4. I was really excited about this book, A Good Girl's Guide to Murder by Holly Jackson. This is a 3-book series. This is the first book in the series. And I'd heard a lot of good things about it on BookTube and on TikTok, and I was disappointed. I didn't really like it. I gave this book a 2-star. I would not necessarily recommend rushing out to buy it, and I won't continue on with the series. Here's why. I felt like maybe I'm not the target audience for this book. This book is a YA, like mystery thriller kind of book, which takes place in a town where 5 years ago, Andy Bell was killed by her boyfriend, Sal. And our main character, Pip, is now in high school 5 years later. For her senior project, she is writing about this murder, but she doesn't think Sal did it. Basically, it's like, did Sal kill Andy, or did someone else kill Andy, and are they still loose? Interesting premise, but I think I was just too old for this book. I think if I was in like 9th or 10th grade in high school, I maybe would have liked it, but the characters were just so unbelievable. There are many moments in here where Pip confronts someone and she should die. Like, she is confronting, like, for example, minor spoiler. She confronts like a drug dealer. The drug dealer is like, ah, you got me. you know? Like, okay, that would not happen. Like, that just wouldn't happen. I almost DNF'd this book like 3 times while reading it, but around the 40% mark, I was just like, okay, the things in this book are not going to be believable, and like, that's okay, just trying to enjoy it. And I did enjoy it a bit more once I sort of turned that part of my brain off. I didn't really see the ending coming, but I also wasn't thinking like too hard about it. I was just trying to enjoy it. I thought it ended a lot better than it began, but still overall, like, I wouldn't buy it again. The 5th book I read is on my Kindle. Let me grab it. 5th book I read is Solitaire by Alice Oseman. I am familiar with Oseman's other work in Heartstopper. I've read the graphic novels, though I don't remember them super well. I read Radio Silence like 4 years ago. I also don't remember that, but I do really enjoy the Netflix series. So Solitaire, what everyone says is that it's kind of her worst book, but I kept seeing it in bookstores and I knew I liked some of Oseman's other work, so I picked it up without really knowing much of what it was about. It follows Tori Spring, who is Charlie's sister from Heartstopper, and it follows Tori when a mysterious sort of like figure starts pranking the school. The figure runs a blog, they call themselves Solitaire, and they're running like a bunch of pranks on the school and hosting events and parties and stuff like that. And Tori starts to realize like, oh shit, this stuff all sort of relates to me. That's the plot of the book. Really, I didn't care about the plot so much. I really liked Tori though. Tori's a unique character. Oseman does a really good job of portraying Tori's deep depression and sort of falling deeper and deeper into depression. And I thought she handled that really well. Tori's like a real asshole for sure, but there were moments of this book where I felt like, wow, I can really relate to what she's saying here. I'm gonna read a couple of those quotes for you. The first thing I do when I get home from school is collapse on my bed and turn on my laptop. This happens every single day. If I'm not at school, you can guarantee my laptop will be somewhere within a 2-meter radius of my heart. My laptop is my soulmate. Dude, if you saw my screen time, okay, here it is. I'm a software engineer. I spend my non-software engineer time on my laptop. So I felt this, and there were like constant moments of that throughout the book where I was like, okay, Tori, this is a little too close to home. Okay, you don't need to call me out here. So I loved Tori. Tori is definitely one of those characters where you're gonna love her or you're gonna hate her. I happen to love her. I also really liked that I went into this book without knowing almost anything. I think if I had known more, I would have sort of been prepared for some of the moments that were going to happen in the book that would have made those moments feel less special. So I don't want to talk too much about it, but I really did like the moments between Tori and another character and how they built up over time. If you've read the book, I'm sure you know who I'm talking about, but there was one other character in the book. The moments they shared with Tori, I was excited about. Every time I was like, all right, the duo's back together. Like, this is gonna be some good shit. And it was. That being said, Tori made some brain dead decisions, man. Come on, get your act together. But I gave this book a 4 out of 5 stars. I really liked it. You would think it would be a 5-star. For me though, 5 stars reserved for my favorite books of all time. This is not necessarily that. It's really close. I would say it's a 4.5 star if I could. But the ending I didn't like so much. I was like, this just does not make sense, I don't think, for her character. There's a big climactic moment at the end where Tori makes a decision that has a lot of consequences. I felt like this whole book was very grounded in realism and portraying depression in a realistic way and portraying like day-to-day life in a realistic way. And this decision that was made at the end of the book was so far from realistic. So even though it made sense in the character development for Tori, like you could see how it was important to her character, I didn't think it made sense in the context of the book overall, because the book itself was so realistic that this decision just didn't really fit in line. And I think honestly, like, that decision could have been left out of the book and it still would have had a really big impact. That's what brought it down to 4 stars for me. I think you should read this book. I think you should know nothing more about it and just go pick it up from the library. Last book I read is called Maybe Today by S.K. Williams. They are a poetry author duo. This is a poetry collection. It's my first poetry collection, so I'm not super qualified to give a review on such a type of story, but I ultimately gave it 3 stars. There's a lot of tabs in here. There were definitely a few that I marked up that I did like, but It was just okay. This book takes place over 4 seasons, so there's different poems for each season, and that's why these tabs are all different, because they take place in different seasons. The poems start very, very traumatic. I would probably read out some trigger warnings for what's talked about in this book before picking it up. And those were very impactful. It's tough to review something like this because by giving it a lower star, it's like, are you ranking their trauma lower? Like, it's kind of weird. I think they did a good job with those poems. I also felt like I could relate to quite a few of the poems in this book, but even if I couldn't relate to it, they did a good job of describing that feeling and helping me to imagine myself in that pair of shoes. But like I mentioned, this is a duo. So the S stands for Shayla and the K stands for Kevin. Kevin writes all the poems and Shayla leaves these little like annotations in red ink on the page. So she reads them and she'll write her little notes on some of the poems. And I felt like this element didn't add very much to the book. Out of all of the poems, I think there was only one poem that I was like, all right, this annotation makes sense and it adds something unique to this piece of art. Like I really liked it. The rest of them, take it or leave it. Most of the annotations are the poem and then Shayla writes, "This sounds so lovely." Like, girl, okay, I did not need that, It just didn't really add much. That being said, I looked up a little bit more about the duo, and after reading the prologue and doing a bit of Googling about the duo, it seems like Shayla and Kevin met and became friends, and then over time fell in love, and they recently got married. And when I sort of learned that, it made more sense, the annotations in the book. It shows like a supportive friend and a supportive partner, and that was an interesting element, but that really just made the annotations just go to okay for me, which was up from annoying. That was part of the reason why I gave it a 3-star. The other reason was that out of the more than 100 poems on here, I don't know exactly how many there are because a couple of them span pages, but there were definitely more than 100 poems. I marked about 25 of them that I wanted to go back to, and I would say I enjoyed about half of them, and the others I just didn't really relate to or moved on pretty quickly, didn't think about too much. Given the 50% hit rate, yeah, 3 stars, take it or leave it. Found it at Target if you're curious. All right, that is the 6 books I read this month. I feel great to be back and reading. There's a couple more video ideas about reading that I have that I'm thinking about doing. I'm thinking for October, I am currently reading, let me grab for you. I'm currently reading Assistant to the Violin, which I'll be finishing up in October. I also am considering picking up the Natural series, and I definitely want to read a couple more classics that are more like Victorian, spooky vibe for Halloween and for October. If you have any recommendations for those, please leave them. If you'd like to see that video, let me know. I have not read very many classics. I've read Picture of Dorian Gray and I've read Dracula. I enjoyed both of those, so I'm interested to read some more. Those are my October plans. Stick around if you want to see how they go. Thanks so much for watching my September reading wrap up. All right, goodbye.